Good evening, Ashwin, and welcome to the Syndic Book Club Author Q&A. It's a delight and an honor to have you join us for the next 1 hour. And I wanted to do a long introduction of you, but I don't think that is necessary. But since we are anyway, I think we should do a little bit of the formality. So, folks, if for those of you who don't know, Ashwin Sanghi is among India's highest-selling English fiction authors, and he has written several bestsellers, categorized into basically three different types or series of books. The first one is what he calls the Bharat Series, and it started off with the Rosabal line in 2008. He followed it up with the Chanakya's chant in the year 2000, then Krishna's key in 2012, the Sialkot saga in 2016, and Keepers of the Kal Chakra in 2018. His latest book, The Vault of Vishnu, came out just over a year back in January 2020. And in between, he has found time to also co-author two books with another best-selling author, James Patterson, which are known as the Private Series, so Private India and Private Delhi. And if that is not enough, he has also authored about, I think, 4 or 5 books in the 13-step series on luck, wealth, health, parenting, and so on. So with that, Ashwin, welcome.
Thank you so much, Abhinav. And when I always have a problem when the introductions are very nice and very elaborate, because then they set you up for failure. So the expectations turn out to be so high कि आप कुछ भी कर लो, you will always perform less than what the introduction seems to indicate. So I have a bit of a problem with great introductions. But thank you.
Mine was not at all great, but there is, see, the question of setting you up for failure does not arise, because with the 13 books under your belt, the #1 bestsellers, I don't think that is a concern, any of us will have that, we are setting Ashwin up. Let me start with your latest book, right? The Vault of Vishnu.
Sure.
Now, you have yet again, spliced up and served us, these are hyperboles that we use, page turner, thriller, and all of that. But it holds true for your latest book also. You have spliced up the past and the present, the historical and the technological. It's a spy thriller meets historical saga. It ranges across multiple countries, whether it is, at the temple or in the and we were just talking about just the timing of the book also turned out to be very interesting, because the book came out in January 2020, and a couple of months later the lockdown hit, and things just ground to a halt. Tell us a little bit about this book.
Well, honestly speaking, I must tell you, as far as I was concerned, the timing was almost, you could say, lucky or damn lucky, one of the two. Because on the one hand, of course, had this book been slightly delayed, then I would not have been able to complete my research, because writing the book required me to go into China a couple of times, which I did in 2019. On the other hand, when the book came out, that was around the time when the Galwan clashes were going on. And as a result of which this topic was on everyone's mind, that, what happens. And then there were news items which were coming out, which were indicating that China is talking about engineering superhuman soldiers. And suddenly everyone said that, did Ashwin have an insight into what the future was going to hold? Not realizing that the world of fact and fiction are very closely interrelated. So when fiction writers write fiction, it's usually based on some kernel of truth that they picked up somewhere. And very often, of course, a lot of the things that happen in the world of factual knowledge tend to also be inspired by fiction. So had it not been for the movie Star Wars, probably Ronald Reagan's entire space program may not have occurred. So, I mean, there is a two-way interchange going on. But as far as this particular book was concerned, I one day was having a cup of tea from a roadside stall, and it was a rather delicious cup of tea because of the extra sugar that had been put in it. And the guy kept on saying, "Saab, aap chini maar ke lenge kya?" I mean, and this is a very common malai maar ke, chini maar ke. This is a very, very common phrase. And he was being generous with the sugar. And then I suddenly realized that the word chini itself comes to us from China, because we treat it as a Chinese product. And of course, later on, I found out that the first Chinese immigrant to Bengal in the late 18th century was someone called Tong Achu, who had actually established this entire sugarcane plantation, and had also created a sugar refinery. And that's the reason we started calling sugar chini. But funnily enough, if you notice from my book, when the Chinese travelers, Wan Zhang, comes to India, one of the things that he is most excited by is to discover sugar and candied sugars, or sugared candies. And he takes some back for the Emperor Taizong when he goes back to China. And so, if you really think about it, the idea of sugar was probably not known to China at that time. And so, we had to take it to them. And then in the 18th century, they had to bring it back to us. And I just found this very, very fascinating, that this sort of interplay was perpetually happening in Indo-Chinese history. And that's how really the Vault of Vishnu was born.
Yes, this is fascinating, right? And and I'll come back to this in a little bit when we go through the Q&A on the research part and how fact and fiction sort of merges into each other at so many different points. In fact, you mentioned Star Wars. The Indian NASA scientist who's been in the news lately, Dr. Swati, she says that she was inspired by the Star Trek series that she watched growing up as a young immigrant child in the 1960s. So very true.
Absolutely.
And tell me about the protagonist, right? Pam Khanna. She is a very interesting character, as is her father, Colonel, the late Colonel Khanna. And you have thrown in a lot of Indian agencies from DRDO and RAW to the Intelligence Bureau. And but actually, let me step a little back. You start off with clashes at Doklam.
Yeah.
And that essentially sets the book off. In now, you talked about research. Now, obviously, you've just said that you went twice to China to do research as part of your book, but obviously, not all of it is possible, right? The places that you talk about, it's in some cases it is not. So, when you talk of Doklam, what led you to start the book from Doklam itself? There are several places along the Indo-China border that have seen that have been flashpoints, right?
Yes. Yes. The frankly, for me, it was a logical starting point, Doklam, because the entire clash was very fresh in one's memory. And there were umpteen articles appearing at that point of time related to the India-China construct in some ways. And this relationship has, of course, Abhinav, been a very, very complicated one. And I will not right now go into the details of that, but the reality is that we in India see our relationship with China only really through the prism of 1950 and thereafter, and that was pretty much the year in which the People's Liberation Army took over Tibet, and then of course subsequently Aksai Chin. But the two countries then of course went to war in 1962, and we were hopelessly unprepared. But China sees this relationship very differently. They see it in the context of a much older and a wider prism. 3,000 years ago, the Zhao monarchs believed that their empire occupied the middle of the earth. So China was called Zhuanghuao, or Middle Kingdom, a glorious empire surrounded by barbarians. And subjugation of the barbarians was one's sacred duty. So other kings would necessarily have to submit to Chinese hegemony for this construct to really work. And so in that sense, in the Chinese perspective, an alliance between China and India by definition would have to be one of a master and a vassal under the Middle Kingdom approach. And so I wanted to start with something like Doklam, which would bring that context to the fore, that here you are as a country which is a democracy, a vibrant democracy, thinking that, hey, listen, we have a rich and historical tradition of a relationship with this great kingdom, and we share many, many commonalities which we have transferred to one another along the Silk Road. But we see our relationship in the construct of what happened post 1950, whereas China sees it over 3,000 years. And I thought this was a great way to bring out this particular element through the book.
And you allude to that in several places during your book also, in conversations that the Chinese officials have among themselves. And at some point, and I'm not going to give out any spoilers or so, you also talk about some of the subtle Chinese psychological, what do you call, what's the word? It's not brainwashing, but it's an indoctrination that also takes place in there. But this is, a continuation of, and I can see, why you call it the Bharat series, but it's a continuation of what you have been writing since, I think, 2008, when you began with the Rosabelle line, right? Where, so let's step and talk about the Bharat series. Why the Bharat series, and was there 1, 2, 5 books that you had in mind when you started out? Did you call it the Bharat series?
Abhinav, it wasn't even a series when I started out. Frankly, I mean, but if you see, like for example, someone would read a book like The Vault of Vishnu and say, hey, this is based on the Indo-China relationship, so it has really nothing to do with let's say a book like, let's say, Chanakya's Chant, which is entirely based out of the kingdom of Magad. But if you really think about it, take something like, for example, Chinese foreign policy. We know that to a very great extent, China's foreign policy is influenced by Sun Tzu's Art of War. And Sun Tzu says that all warfare is based on deception. And when we are able, we should seem unable. When we are in action, we must seem inactive. When we are near, we should seem far. When far, the enemy should think that we are near. In other words, this was all strategy, Sun Tzu's strategy. But, think about this. If China can look to Sun Tzu, then India has Kautilya, whose strategic views were no less profound. So he says that if the ends can be achieved by non-military means, even by methods of intrigue and duplicity, an armed conflict is not advised. And any activity which harms the progress of the enemy engaged in similar stuff is also to be considered as progress. And then, of course, most importantly, he talks about GDP. He says that the prosperous one becomes the victorious one. So if you really think about it, the two books, when we are talking about two books which seem utterly divergent, which is The Vault of Vishnu and Chanakya's Chant, they are actually connected by a thread, which is in terms of strategic thinking. So what I really wanted to bring about was a series, and the series approach took place only after around the third book. The Rosabelle line was an independent book, and Chanakya's Chant was written as an independent title. And then I realized, no, but there is a commonality to them, because in all instances, I am looking at, in some ways, the word Bharatiya. In some ways, I'm trying to consider whether it is in terms of history, whether it's culture, whether it's geography, whether it is science, philosophy. There are so many elements, and it doesn't necessarily need to be about the geographical landmass called Bharat, but it is also about ideas and views, which were fundamentally Bharatiya in nature. And so by the time we reached the third book, that's the time when I sat with my publisher and I said, hey, listen, there seems to be one common thread running through this. So why don't we label it the Bharat series? So it was only when the fourth book, the Sialkot saga, came out that we rebranded all the previous books as the Bharat series.
And it's interesting. You talked about Chanakya's chant, and then you mentioned some of the statecraft advice written by Sun Tzu in The Art of War. And I think in your book you also say what the tragedy is, that the Chinese have read Chanakya, but we have not bothered to read Sun Tzu. And
Absolutely.
there is
Absolutely.
so much of statecraft even in my favorite book, the Mahabharata. Whether it is
Absolutely.
Vidur Niti or so many other places.
Absolutely. And in
What?
fact, Abhinav, according to me, a lot of people look at the Kurukshetra war and think that that is to a very great extent, the ultimate in terms of warcraft or statecraft in some ways. But actually, if you go further down towards the Shanti Parva, that, according to me, is even further evolved in terms of, because it's far easier to think strategically during wartime. It's even more difficult to think during peacetime. So
Exactly. I mean, the Raj Dharma, the Apad Dharma, and the Dan Dharma Parvas. Here is the compiler, the author, call it whatever you will, of the Mahabharata, who laid it out. That, guys, here is what you do in times of peace. Here is what you do in times of distress. It's sad, but I think we'll talk about that maybe at some other time.
sure.
Now, the other thing I wanted to talk to you again, staying with the Vault of Vishnu for just a few more minutes, Kanchipuram.
Yeah.
Now, living in Bangalore, we've been to Kanchi a few times, and it is truly, I think, the only other town that approaches it in being called the town of temples is probably Kumbakonam. But many people don't know, as part of their history, that
Yes.
Kanchi is more than just a temple town. It has been the birthplace of dynasties,
Yes.
and the connections that you bring over into in your book to Kanchi are no less staggering.
Yes.
Uh, anything in particular that led you to, obviously in the plot it all fits together, but anything that led you to pick Kanchi as a town in your research, or was it one of several places that you were thinking of?
For me, Kanchi was just fascinating because of the Pallava connection, frankly. I mean, and the moment one talks Pallavas, then one has to bring in the Cambodia connection. And that is just, again, sort of, it makes you realize. I think my dear friend Sanjeev Sanyal's book about the ocean of churn was one of those where suddenly you realize that, my God, when we are talking about this entity called India or Bharat, how much wider was it, and what was the extent to which ideas had traveled. And if you really think about it, even in terms of our own mythology, you can have so-called 300 versions of the Ramayana, which includes, for example, the Lao Ramayana, in which Ram is a bodhisattva. So you can imagine the extent to which these ideas had traveled. And I found it rather strange because most of my books had been dealing mostly with the North Indian stuff that was going on. And we almost treat the Deccan as if it's sort of not part of Indian history, uh, which I'm also guilty of that, because 5 books really did not have any element of that South Indian sort of flavor, except for possibly the Sialkot saga, which had a little element of Travancore in it. But other than that, most of the books have dealt with North Indian history. And I found that this was actually a far more robust historical narrative to be providing, because here were kings. I mean, and frankly, there was not much to distinguish the Pallava kings from the Cambodian kings. So I mean, in the sense that if you really think about it, Kanchi and Cambodia were actually one ancient sort of axis in some ways. And then when you go back to the very ancient story of Khambu Raja, the South Indian king who traveled and faced opposition from a beautiful lady on a mountain, and then eventually defeated and married her. Now, of course, a lot of that we know is probably some element of mythological and fantasy also. But it's such a wonderful story, and that the country they jointly ruled came to be known as Kambuja Desa, and their descendants were the Khmer people. And then the country eventually began to be called Kampuchea and then Cambodia. Uh, and then you go a little further down, and then you realize the story of a king called Bhima, the younger brother of the so-called Pallava king Simha Vishnu. And he travels and marries a princess and then is crowned the Cambodian king. Um, I, I, I find it fascinating that you have Cambodian kings taking on the suffix Varman, which is pretty much like the Pallava kings, or the fact that it wasn't just a one-way street, and that you also had Cambodian kings being brought into Kanchi when they did not have successors. Like, for example, when the
Correct.
Pallava king Parmeshwara Varman died, then it was a successor of Bhima who was brought in. So if you really look at the two-way interplay that was going on here, it was fascinating. And for whatever reason, we Indian historical and mythological fiction authors have treated this as one black hole in some ways. So I thought that this was the right time to do it. And plus, of course, it linked in beautifully with the martial arts story. And so it was just sort of,
E- Exactly. And good. I'm going to hold on to that point, and I'm going to come to you on that part in just again a little bit. But now I want to talk a little bit about your. See, in your fiction series, there's a Bharat series, that you have written, I think, about 5, 6 books now. But in between, in 2015 and 17, you also found the time to co-author 2 books with James Patterson,
sure.
and the Private India and Private Delhi series. How did that come about?
Uh, Abhinav, actually, partly one of the reasons for that happening was because I, as an individual, am always very, very worried about being compartmentalized. I mean, I am always paranoid that people will say, oh, Ashwin Sanghi is that historical and mythological fiction writer. And in other words, in some ways, a label gets attached to your name that this is what you do. Uh, Whereas, frankly, the only label that I ever want is the label of a storyteller. When I go to lectures and events, people think that I am some vidwan, that I'm a historian, that I'm a theologian, that I'm in some ways, some of them even treat me as some sort of philosopher of sorts. And I have to keep telling them that, listen, guys, when I write a book, at that time I do a lot of research, but it's not as if I've come to that particular story having known everything about it. I knew very little about it. And in the process of writing the book, I got to know a lot more about it. But now, if you suddenly imagine that just because Ashwin could write the Vault of Vishnu, which was this Pallava story, therefore he will also know everything that happened in the Chola period. No, Ashwin does not. So, in that sense, what I do is I simply take a construct of history, mythology, philosophy, science, and I use them as my construction materials in order to spin a good yarn. And so, if you're spinning a good yarn, then does it matter whether you're in the space of history or mythology or science or philosophy? Or should something as simple as crime also be able to allow you to spin a yarn? And that's
Mm.
how I said, hey, listen, this is something totally new, fresh, innovative, and I would love to try my hand at it. I had already read a few of the James Patterson books, particularly the Alex Cross series, so I was
Mhm.
a fan of sorts. And at that time, in 2014, a dear friend of mine from Random House happened to be stationed in the UK, and James Patterson's literary representative for Europe and the rest of the world, other than US, was also stationed out of that same office in London. And these two ladies got talking, and James's person said that, hey, listen, James wants to write a thriller that's set in India. And my friend turned around and said, hey, listen, I have the right thriller writer for you. And so, हम लोगों के इंडिया में arranged marriage होता है. This was an arranged marriage where two ladies got together over lunch and they figured it out.
What a blow for patriarchy. So, ठीक है. So you don't want to be, boxed into one category as a writer of, particular kind. ठीक है. Now you wrote the 13-step series. Now, see, I have 2 questions for you. First of all, 13 is not exactly, a number that comes to mind to a lot of people when they want to start something or name something, or,
Oh,
the second is, if that is not interesting enough, the second thing you had is 13 steps to what, luck.
yes.
ये तो like this is trying to combine two absolutely polar opposites and smashing them in the hopes of getting fusion, and I'm sure there's a fascinating story behind that.
Well, there is actually, because you know a lot of people know me, of course, as this writer today who has been moderately successful, but they do not know the backstory of Ashwin Sanghi. That my education was in economics, so I have a BA in economics, and I have an MBA in finance. Uh, and for the better part of 15 years, I was actively involved in running a family business. Uh, and so literary pursuits was not something that was ever sort of mapped out or even in my realm of possibilities, as it were. And then, sometime around 2002, 2003, when I ended up visiting Srinagar, and the chance visit to the Rosabal Shrine resulted in a deep fascination for that particular tomb. And over the next year or two, I wanted to research everything that I could. It eventually resulted in that first book, The Rosabal Line. And that is when I started applying to publishers and literary agents. And when I applied to them, I realized that most of them were either not replying back, or if they were replying back, they were saying thank you, but no thank you. And so eventually there was a situation where I had about roughly 47 literary agents and publishers telling me, you know, for lack of a better term, get lost. Uh, and I just was really down on my luck in that sense. Now, in our house, my father used to, meet with a dear family friend of ours. And the two of them would meet over the weekends and they would have their whiskey together. And this Punjabi friend of my dad's, he said, "Beta, kya ho gaya? Tum bade depressed lag rahe ho." So I said, "Uncle, मैं क्या करूं? ये 47 लोगों ने कह दिया है कि भाई thank you but no thank you." So he said, "Remember one thing, beta, that life is 99% about luck." So he was having his Johnny Walker Black Label. So both of them, father and him, they used to pour for each other because they knew that they will be generous with one another. So they used to pour these large Patiala pegs for one another. So he had his full peg lying with him. He said, "No, in life, 99% is about good luck." So I said, "But uncle, then what is that 1%? That 1% must be hard work, efficiency, management, talent, resources, networking. There are so many things which play a role." And Abhinav, he took his whiskey and he drained it instantly. And he then put the glass down on the table and he said, "Beta, 99% is good luck and 1% is bloody good luck." So I, I was, I, at that time, I think maybe I was too depressed or I was too young to really be able to understand it. But many, many years later, after I had already become a successful author, I was at a lit fest in Chennai, and a young lady asked me about the role of luck, and I narrated this story to her. And she followed me outside the auditorium and she said, "Sir, if your story is to be believed, then in that case, I may as well sit in my house and watch television all day. Because if it's 99% luck and 1% bloody good luck, मैं कुछ भी नहीं करूं, automatically जो आना होगा वो आएगा." So when I heard that, and my publisher Gautam Padmanabhan was standing next to me in that visitors area, so he started laughing and he said, "Okay, she's put you on a spot. Now you better explain, what do you mean by 1% bloody good luck?" And that is when I started realizing that those who we consider to be lucky are not necessarily people who have some great opportunities raining down on them from the heavens. It's the fact that they know how to make the best of those opportunities. So they have gone through a process of being able to recognize those opportunities when they come, and they are better prepared in order to take advantage of those opportunities when they present themselves. And I wanted to explain that through a small little book. And of course, in 13, of course, it gets a very bad rap. It's down the ages. There have been so many reasons why we consider 13 to be a bad number, including the absence of the 13th law from the Code of Hammurabi, and the fact that Judas was the 13th to sit at the table of the Last Supper, and that Friday the 13th began to be looked at as an unlucky date. And so it was almost tongue in cheek. It was ironic to say, when you say
Yes.
13 steps to bloody good luck, well, it's almost like saying, listen, guys, please understand that it's not about luck. It's about a lot of things that you have to do. So that and that title really worked, because no one expected that title would really sell, because after all, I'm known as a fiction writer, and that to a historical mythological fiction writer. So no one really expected that we would sell too much, but it went into multiple print runs within that first year itself. So and then of course my publisher came back to me and said that since we could take a concept like luck and we could demystify it, then why can't we demystify so many other topics that deserve to be demystified? And that's how then a series was born.
It's fascinating. I remember reading someone said, that he said, the harder I work, the luckier I get.
Sure, of course. And but I mean that is one part of it. But there are also, for example, there is the Roman philosopher Seneca, who said that luck is simply a matter of preparation meeting opportunity. For example, of course, my favorite definition of luck is the French actor Jean Cocteau, who said that, of course, I believe in luck. How do you explain the success of those whom you don't like? So, everyone's definition of luck is very different in the world. But the idea was to try and give you some sort of a framework in terms of trying to tell you what is it that people who we consider to be lucky, what is it that they actually do. And I broke that down into basically a very simple formula known as 3R. 3R meaning raise, recognize, and respond. How do you raise the number of opportunities that come your way? So, for example, if you're sitting on a flight next to someone, do you sit quietly and read your book? Or do you strike up a conversation, because that may turn out to be someone who may be very interested in what you are doing? So it may be an opportunity to have that conversation. So how do you raise the opportunities? Second, how do you recognize them? So in other words, are you in a position to be able to distinguish between those opportunities which are worthwhile and those which may not be so worthwhile? And finally, of course, how do you respond? So how do you make sure that you respond to the opportunity in a way that it can actually play out in a lucky manner? So that is what that book was about.
Needless to say, I think I'm so fascinated. I have to go get that book.
Please do. It's a for a voracious reader like you, it will not even take you an hour or 2 hours to read it. It's filled with little interesting nuggets and anecdotes, and most importantly, I think most of it is common sense. It is just a reminder of the common sense that we already have.
Common sense is very, very uncommon. So I think periodic reminders can't hurt any of us, Ashwin. I want to move to a slightly different set of questions now. And since we are the Indic Book Club and we have, several writers, aspiring writers who have started exploring this genre of, mythological fiction or fiction based on our epics, our itihasa, Puranas and all.
Sure.
Let's talk about the process of writing, because again, a book such as yours just doesn't get written because you feel like it and then 2 days later the book is done.
Absolutely.
There's a huge amount of work that goes into it. So I want to pick your brain a little bit. So there is the coming up with the idea, doing the research, doing the plotting, the outlining, the writing, and all of that. Now, some authors like Stephen King, for example, he doesn't believe in doing any kind of, outlining, detailing. He says, just write with the
He
flow.
looks down on it. In fact, Stephen King looks down on it.
Correct. Then there are some who say that, for each scene that I will have, I just write one line, so that serves as a guidepost for me. There are some, like I think R.L. Stein, who has said that I do my plotting in detail. Then there is P.G. Woodhouse, who used to spend more time on research than on writing and all. What is your approach to, if you're starting a new book project, for example?
Well, typically for me, it happens in stages. Stage one is ideation. And ideation is not something that you just press a button and an idea pops out. I have generally found, Abhinav, that some of our finest ideas are when we are not planning to write a book. So they emerge through the day, they emerge through the seasons, the months. But the problem is that the vast majority of us do not capture the idea at that moment. It's almost the equivalent of a photographer seeing something very, very interesting and taking a snapshot of it at that moment. So either he's captured it or otherwise it's gone. The way at least I operate is that I maintain a journal. My journal is maintained on an email account. So that is an email account which only Ashwin Sanghi uses to email himself. And it could be something that has emerged from our discussion today. I may find that you've asked me a question that has left me zapped. So I may email that to myself. I may be reading a book where I come across an interesting paragraph. I'll take a snapshot and email it to myself. I may be on the web and look at an interesting online video, or I am traveling into a city and I see an interesting site or a hoarding or a message, and I keep sending this sort of stuff to myself. The idea is that I have this journal of ideas, which I go back to whenever I'm starting the process of writing a new book, because at that time, I'm not looking for fresh ideas. I'm simply looking at the ideas that I've already captured. And then choosing between them. So that is the first stage. The second stage is the research stage. So the research stage typically will involve different levels of research. For example, the Vault of Vishnu involved visits into China, but also involved reading up about Xuanzang and reading the narratives of Xuanzang related to his visit into India. But if you take, for example, a book like, let's say, Chanakya's Chant, it was simply reading the Arthashastra and the Mudra Rakshas and reading them enough times to be able to figure out as to what was common between the politics of 2300 years ago versus the politics of today. Or if you take, let's say, a book like the Krishna Key, it involved not only a reading of the Mahabharata, but also a reading of, also a visit into places like Somnath and Mathura and Dwarka, all the places associated with the Krishna life story. If you look at a book like, let's say, Keepers of the Kal Chakra, it involved actually 6 months sitting with a friend of mine who was an engineer from IIT Bombay and making him teach me the fundamentals of quantum theory, which I mean, being a BA student, I had no clue of, so it was like quantum theory 101, in order to be able to then understand it and apply it into the world of spirituality and philosophy.
So let me just interrupt you here, Ashwin. The process of, you pick up an idea that appeals to you and then doing the research, I'm reasonably sure it won't be a linear process, because in the course of your research, you will find things that possibly lead you back to the drawing board.
Of course. So these two stages are not sequential. They happen, very often you'll do research and then you'll say, oh, but why is my idea this? Then you go back in order to re-evolving the idea. So these go more or less hand in hand. The Krishna Key, for example, I had always had a fascination for the idea of whether the Mahabharata was a real story or whether we could consider it mythological. Whereas my personal view was that it was a historical event, which over the years, because it was narrated by generation after generation, it became more and more fantastical. But the kernel of truth in the historical veracity of those events was very much there. So because I had that idea and I happened to be at someone's party where I ended up meeting up someone who was royally drunk that particular evening. And luckily for me that day, I was also 4 or 5 drinks down. So I did not find it unusual for this guy to be saying what he did to me. But what he let on to me rather confidentially was that he considered that he was the 10th incarnation of Vishnu. Now, at that moment, honestly speaking, I didn't know what to think. I came back, I went off to sleep. The next morning, I got up with a hangover. And then I remembered what this guy had told me. And that's when I got in touch with a dear friend of mine who's based out of Chandigarh and is a scholar, a bit of a vidwan. And I said, Yaar, tumne ye Kalki Puran padha hai kya? And he said, yes. In fact, I have a very good translation. So he sent me the PDF into English of the Kalki Puran, and I read it that day, and I said, "Wow, this is almost like the revelations from the Bible." It's, this avenger of sorts will come riding on a white horse with this sword in his hand and will avenge all evil and purge the earth of evil. This is outstanding, and that's when I decided to merge those two stories: the story of a 10th incarnation of Vishnu in present times, and the idea of the Mahabharata having been a historical event. So this often happens, this interplay between those two stages. But essentially, I will end up spending somewhere around maybe 9 months to 12 months stuck between stage 1 and 2. And then
Wow.
that's the time when I'll move into the third stage, which is the plotting stage. And unlike Stephen King, I can't write without a plot. I need a detailed plot.
What
Uh,
does it look like? Because doing a lot of research, one of the drawbacks could be that one falls in love with the research and one wants to put all of that research in the
of
book
course it does.
itself.
Of course it
So
does.
how,
So
how, how do you balance
So
that then?
that's precisely the point, that when you are sitting down to develop your plot, you follow certain. Now, for example, in my case, my plot outlines are always done on Excel spreadsheets. So for me,
Thank you.
one row is typically a chapter on a spreadsheet, and
Okay.
so the first column will be chapter number. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then the next column. Okay, let's take it in the form of an example. The Sialkot Saga is a
Mm-hmm.
book which spans 70 years of two characters, Arvind and Arbaz. Both of them are out to get each other. They are business rivals, political rivals, but their entire life story is narrated through the prism of Indian history over the last 70 years. So the way my plot outline works is that the first column is the year 1947, 1948, 1949, all the way down to the 2000s. Then I have two columns, which is Arvind's age and Arbaz's age. So in both instances, I know that, okay, in that year, what was the age of these guys? Then after that, I'm looking at, okay, what would these guys have been doing in those ages? Were they in school? Were they bunking school? Were they setting up a business? Were they experiencing their first kiss? Were they running a scam? What were they doing? Uh, were they killing someone? So those are the next two columns where I'm talking about what they were doing. Then I talk about what is the hook at which I'm going to leave the reader at the end of that chapter. So, what is that little nugget of information that I'm not going to reveal at this stage, which will force you to get to the next chapter? And finally, of course, I have a final chapter which talks about the backdrop of India. What was happening culturally, socially, economically? What were the great events in that year? Was it the year of the emergency? Was it the year when the
Okay.
Dalai Lama came into India? Was it the year of the Indochina War? What was it? So the idea being that when you are framing those characters, you're framing them in the context of a backdrop. So typically for me, the most the most structured method is an Excel sheet. And what it does is it forces a certain discipline in terms of having to establish what happens in that chapter within a couple of hundred words, and also
Hmm.
forces you to create a hook in order to keep the reader motivated enough to turn the page. The most difficult quality in commercial fiction writing is to get people to turn the page. People don't understand it. They think that it's about fancy words, it's about great grammar, it's about stylistic elements. No, you're writing a commercial paperback fiction thriller. In that case, the only thing that you're supposed to be doing is telling a bloody good story, the sort of story that a person doesn't want to get up or forces the person to turn the page. So for me, the plot is the stage at which I can do that. I can't do it when I go into the writing stage. I have to do it at the plotting stage. And because you're doing that plotting, you also, during the plotting stage, you realize that what is the research that you have done, which has no relevance whatsoever to your plot. And those are the research points that you need to knock out because you know that they are going to only slow down your story. So that is what happens during the plotting stage. Typically, that can take anywhere between 3 to 4 months for me.
Just the plotting
Just
stage.
the plotting stage. And then finally, the next stage is the writing. By the time I go into the writing stage, Abhinav, at that stage, frankly, it's the easiest part of what I do because the research is done, the ideation is done, the plot is already there, and it's almost like a children's coloring book. The outlines are drawn for you. You, as a kid, need to decide, will I use a red crayon or a green crayon or a blue crayon within those outlines? So you can still make a few changes to your outline, but the fundas are already there for you. So that typically takes me around maybe anywhere around 6 to 7 months. And then, of course, that takes me into the final stage, which is the rewrites. I end up doing at least 2 or 3 rewrites. And then, of course, it moves into the publisher's hands for editing. And
So, how substantial are the rewrites? So, let's take, for example, about a 350-page book will be about 80 to 90,000 words.
Yes.
When you have finished your first draft and before you have started the rewrite, roughly how long would it be?
So typically, actually, the rewrites will, I do not keep a track of the number of times that I've actually rewritten chapters while I've been working on the manuscript.
Mm-hmm.
That in any case has happened along the way.
Correct.
Because very often I will go back to a chapter and say, no, but I hadn't included that little nugget of information there. So I'll go back to chapter 20, even though I'm working on chapter 50. And then when I read chapter 20, I say, no, I need to do a little bit of rework on it. So those rewrites have in any case happened during the time when I was writing the book. But typically, once I'm done with the manuscript, once it's over and I've put the 3 asterisks to indicate that it's the end of the manuscript, then that's the time where typically after a gap of a day, I will again print it out as a PDF and put it on my Kindle. And then I will start reading it as if I'm a reader. And all the stuff that I'm finding is not moving fluidly. The stuff that doesn't sound right to the ear, the stuff that I feel is causing friction in my appreciation of it as a reader.
But how do you do that?
Those.
But Ashwin, it's your work. You have researched, plotted, outlined, written every word. How do you separate yourself? How do you separate the author from the reader?
Very, very difficult. Honestly speaking, I also utilize a few sounding boards. There are about 5 or 7 people in my ecosystem who also end up reading that first draft along with me. So they will also send me their comments that this part of it is not seeming right, or this seems to be feeling a little forced. It is not seeming real. So those are the sort of things that I want. At that stage, I'm not looking for comments about stylistic elements or sentence structure or any of that. I'm simply looking at the story. That does the story keep you gripped or not? So I will end up doing at least 2 or 3 reads, and I'll use the highlighter function on Adobe Acrobat in order to keep highlighting those portions that I think I will need to go back to. And then again, a couple of days later, I will sit along with the iPad and my Word document and sort of look at those highlighted portions, see what I need to rework on. So it's a process which happens, at least for me, normally at least around 3 times before eventually I will feel comfortable enough to pass it on to my editor. So I've always maintained that I'm not a great writer. I'm a fairly decent storyteller, uh, and I'm a good rewriter. So, uh, sort of moderately good writer, slightly better storyteller, and slightly better rewriter.
This is, for folks watching this or who will watch this later, this is a masterclass all in itself, and I say this with all sincerity. We are already 54 minutes into our Q&A, so I don't have to pretend to be nice to you. I really mean it, folks. So what to recap, you use Excel for your plotting, Microsoft Word for your writing, and
Actually, the initial manuscript doesn't get developed on uh, MS Word. MS Word comes into the picture only when the manuscript is completed. During the stage when I'm actually writing it up chapter wise, I use a software called Scrivener, which allows me to actually sort of create my outline on corkboard style plotting
oh,
cards.
okay,
So
okay.
I transfer all my material from Excel to Scrivener. Then each of those chapters is written up like a short story in Scrivener. Then Scrivener allows me to take that entire material and convert it into a single manuscript, which gets exported into Microsoft Word. Uh, so
Ah.
it's yeah, it's I have a funny way of working. I'm sorry.
No, no. This is fascinating, and maybe someday I'll share my story of how Excel saved my life in writing my book, because I was hopelessly lost. I didn't know all of these
That was a
things that
good
it
book.
is.
If I recall correctly, I had blurbed that book for you, if I remember.
Yes, you did.
That, and I remember reading it. So it did not seem by any stretch of the imagination that you were struggling.
And so thank you, Ashwin, and I have to thank Excel for it. It saved my life in because all the good advice you have given me. Had I known that 2 years, 3 years back, I wouldn't have struggled. But having used Excel, I can say with personal experience, I can totally relate to what you have just said. It so don't let no one ever feel like a geek or like a bean counter for using Excel. And I think a Scrivener is interesting. I will try it out. uh, and the other thing that for people listening, your advice that don't read it from the point of view of a reader, and don't fall in love with your own words simply because you have written them. I think it's very, very important. And then the ability to tell a story. People have to want to turn the page for
It was
commercial fiction.
Hawthorne who said that, easy reading is damn hard writing. So people don't understand how difficult it is to produce easy reading because the smoothest khichdi has been cooked for many, many hours in order to give you that smoothness of texture of a great khichdi or a great biryani. So, I mean, at the end
Exactly.
of the day, that process of writing, rewriting, is so critical in terms of making, people ask me what is it that creates a great bestseller. Is there a formula? And I say very simple, really. Your first paragraph is like a pothole, which means that a person falls into the pothole and can't come out of it. So suck the reader into that story so that they can't get out of that
I'm
story.
sure the BMC and BBMP will love
Love
you
it.
for that statement.
Absolutely. Love or hate, whatever. They're two sides of the same coin. And then the second golden rule is that every chapter should end on a hook. When I'm writing a story, it was it was the uh, it was the Hollywood director Alfred Hitchcock who said that the length of a movie is related to the endurance of the human bladder. So, which means you can only sit and watch a movie for that much time that your bladder holds out. So, the way I like to think of my story writing process is that I'm sitting in a room with 10 people, sitting in a circle around me, and I'm telling them a story. And Out of that lot of 10 people, there are three or four who need to get up and take a bathroom break. But they don't get up and take that bathroom break because the next twist is around the corner. So every chapter has to have that hook which will propel you into the next chapter. And finally, the last paragraph of your book should almost be like that satisfying burp at the end of a meal. I mean, you can have a very good meal, but I mean, particularly in the Middle East, if you haven't burped, it means that you didn't enjoy your food. It should be that sense of satisfaction that all the loose threads have been resolved, that the hero or the protagonist did not win by chance, that you as the reader had an equal opportunity to have been able to solve that puzzle. All of those things must fit in that last paragraph where you get that complete sense of satisfaction and resolution. And of course, most importantly, your last paragraph should make your reader look out for your next book so that you can continue to be a bestseller. So those are the 3 rules. Easy
Fascinating.
enough.
Easy enough. So Ashwin, I have a couple of questions that have come in, and I think you have pretty much answered in detail one of them, which said that, I'll read out the question. You have said previously, and this is from Deepak, that you are more of a storyteller than a writer. How can a writer become a successful storyteller? Can you give some tips for aspiring writers? And I think you've covered it in great detail, but is there anything you want to add?
No, I would say that too many people who are looking to come out with either a book or with a novel or a novella or a short story, they get too focused on the words. And the words is one part of that entire thing which any editor worth his or her dime can sort out for you. What most editors cannot do is tell a good story. And if they could have told a good story, then they wouldn't be editors. So one has to understand that ultimately, the way I see it is that, you take someone like James Patterson, who I worked with on 2 books. James rarely ever writes a novel, except for the Alex Cross series, where he actually writes out the novel. But otherwise, for most other books, he simply writes out a 30 to 40 page outline, which he shares with his collaborator. And he says, I have written up the story, the entire arc, the entire development, all the twists and turns are already plotted right here. Now go ahead and write it up.
Fascinating.
So that's the difference between a storyteller and a writer.
There's one more question that are all the characters of the novel fictitious, or have you been inspired by any real people in general? Do you borrow traits from real people while you create characters? This question also comes from Deepak.
And Deepak is, I know which particular book he is referring to. He's referring to Chanakya's chant, where there is this character called Ganga Sagar Mishra, who is a modern day politician, who is the equivalent of the ancient day Chanakya. And
Correct.
a lot of people ask me, this character, is he based on someone or the other? Is this based on some real life politician? And then I have to explain to them, I said, listen, look at the dimensions of this character. And you will find that this particular thing that he did was related to what Atal Bihari Vajpayee's behavior would have been. You look at this, it looks like Narsimha Rao. You look at this, it looks like Indira Gandhi. You look at this element, it looks like Mayawati. There are multiple character traits that I've picked up from multiple politicians and embedded them into this character of Ganga Sagar Mishra. So yes, one does get influenced by real characters. Very often you pick up the entire character. Like, for example, going back again to the same story, Chanakya's chant, Ganga Sagar Mishra's style, first of all, the name, the style, the fact that he wears a dhoti kurta and he carries an umbrella and has very little hair on his head. These were all influenced by one Masterji who used to come to our house in order to teach us multiplication tables. And when we didn't do our homework properly, he used to take his chhata and he used to wrap up. So that entire image of Masterji was very much there in my mind when I wrote up this particular character. So we do get influenced by real world characters. It's just that we explain them in fictional terms because we don't want to get sued.
And yeah, Gaurav Kumar says that, okay, first he praises me, which is fine. I'll read it out. Interviewers asking very relevant questions. Incidentally, he has asked all the questions that I had in my mind. Kudos to you. Thank you, Gaurav. And then he says, Ashwin, even though you said that commercial page turners should not concentrate much on vocabulary, sentence structure, etc., however, I must say your books use quite good words. It's a treat to read your works. Your books keep writing and keep enthralling your readers.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful for those words of praise. But let me tell you, a lot of my books read the way they do because of a team effort of a lot of people, and particularly my editor, who's based out of Kolkata, she is just like, she's the most terrifying editor to work with, and but at the same time she really makes me readable, because but I think the one thing that should be stressed out here is when I'm saying that it is not relevant to worry about the words or the sentence structure or the grammar. I don't mean that you as a writer should not read. I think as a writer or as a storyteller, it's far easier to be able to spin your yarns in case you are continuously exposing yourself to other people's writing. And I think the process of evolving as a writer is a lot to do with the reading process. So I think I was very fortunate because I had my paternal granduncle who used to send me one book every week during my growing up years. During my lifetime, while my school and college education was going on, the old man sent me more than 300 books, ranging from classics to mythology to philosophy, to even fast-paced fiction. So I think that just created that necessary. It hardwired my brain in terms of what are the little tricks of storytelling. What do you need? Like for example, when I was working on a book with James Patterson, he said, "Listen, you told me who this guy is in chapter 20. You need to tell me in chapter 20. Can't we push this to chapter 40? We'll extend the suspense, Or, for example, in chapter 4, you've brought me this guy who's killed. Instead, can't we kill him in chapter 1? Let's start with the murder." So there are lots and lots of little things which you don't realize initially when you start out writing. And then over a period of time, you begin to pick up on these things. I have always maintained that commercial fiction writing is not an art. Please make a note of this. It is not an art, it is a craft. So it is not like an MF Hussain standing in front of a canvas and deciding that, okay, I'm going to use broad brush strokes and I'm doing this. It's almost like a carpenter making chairs and deciding that, okay, his first chair is going to be very different to the 100th chair, and the 100th chair will be very different to the 1000th chair. So I always maintain that don't take yourself too seriously because you are work in progress. All that you want to do is you want to be 5% better than your last book. That's it.
This is very true. We'll close with one last question, Ashwin, and then any final words that you have. So the question comes from Neeraj Singh, who asks, "Sir, when when you're choosing an idea to write a book, what should be more important for an author, according to you? Market demand, evaluation, or that you like the idea?"
Sure. Frankly, Abhinav, I would, at least the way I like to approach this is that at the time when I'm ideating, I don't want to think about the market at that time. Because otherwise there will be many stories that will never get written. At the time when I was writing the Rosabal line, I would never have approached that. In the days when I was writing the Rosabal line, which I'm talking about is now the period in the run up to 2006. So those 3 or 4 years. If you were an Indian writer, you were pretty much expected either to be writing romance, campus romance, or alternatively, you were expected to be writing award-winning fiction like an Arundhati Roy or a Salman Rushdie, or alternatively, you were expected to be writing family sagas, dynastic stories. And finally, if you didn't want to be in the world of fiction, then you wrote a non-fiction book on how to make the best biryani. Now, those were the spaces that you as an Indian author functioned in. If you were writing a commercial thriller, then most of the publishers at that time didn't want to publish you because they already had a very neat little business running with the Dan Browns and the Jeffrey Archers and the Sidney Sheldons. So in those days, if you went into any bookstore and you looked at the bestseller rack, it was always foreign authors who were at the top of that rack because that space was not open to Indian authors. And so if you think of someone like me, Ashwin Sanghi, a Marwadi businessman who decides to turn into a thriller writer and then writes a story about Jesus Christ possibly having survived the crucifixion and having traveled to India and lying buried in a tomb called Rosabal. Uh, and these guys would look at me and say, "Have you lost your mind?" I mean, so there was no marketability of that story at the time when it was written. But I'm so glad that I wasn't thinking about the market at that point of time. Otherwise, I wouldn't have written the Rosabal line. This is where I'm coming from, that there are many, many stories that need to be told. Don't put on your marketing cap at the time when you are ideating. Put on the marketing cap once you are done with the manuscript and you have a polished product in your hands. At that point of time, become the Amir Khan of the world and decide that, okay, I'm going to bloody spend next 3 months or 6 months marketing the shit out of this. That's fine. At that point of time, don't any longer be a writer or a storyteller, because now your job is to be a banya and to figure out as to how many books this book can reach, how many books can be sold, and how many hands can actually hold that book. So there are two very distinct phases, and one should not mix them up.
Wonderful advice, Ashwin. Any last words for our viewers?
Well, from the questions that you've asked me in the last one half of this interview, I take it that the aim is to reach out to a lot of people who are aspiring writers. So for them, I have a couple of, you could say, bulleted points as words of parting advice. Number one, that don't think of yourself as a writer, be a storyteller. That's very important. Number two, that don't lose the day job. It's important. It's very difficult to write when you're hungry. So keep the income flowing. Writing is something that you can do at any time. I wrote the Rosabal line in the middle of the night between 10 o'clock and 12:30 in the morning. So, there's no reason why you can't take out 2 hours or an hour every day to be able to work on your writing passion. But keep your day, it's because it's going to be several months or years by the time that royalties will be able to sustain you. So keep the day job. The third is that don't worry too much about what the critics say. If you're going to all the time be worrying about what someone else perceives of your work, then you will never be able to write the story that you really want to tell from your heart. So it's very important to develop a thick skin. We as writers, what we do is we are almost the equivalent of, we've taken off all our clothes. Now we are standing nanga and we've got up onto a stage and there is 1,000 people surrounding us and everyone has a rock in their hand and they have the freedom to throw the rock at you. So whether you like it or not, that's the nature of creative pursuit. No matter how good a movie is, there will be 10%, 20%, 30% people who come out and say, "Yaar, wo acha tha, but there was something else that was missing." So don't worry too much on that front. The fourth thing I would say is that it is important for all those who want to be writers and want to, over a period of time, remain in that space, to understand that if you are successful, then understand that the words that came on your page were not your words. They were a blessing from Ma Saraswati, who put those words into your head. So just bow down to Ma and say, "Thank you, Ma, for deeming that I am worthy of receiving these words." And keep your feet on the ground.
Thank you, Ashwin. Words to live by. And again, for all those who have watched, and we will put this up on YouTube in a few days. And I hope you watch this. There is more value and worth in it than I think I would have, expected. So thank you, Ashwin, once again for coming to the Syndic Book Club author Q&A. And folks, thank you.
Thank you so much, Abhinav. And as one of your commenters said, thank you for those wonderful questions. It was a delight to be able to be in conversation with you. And thank you to the audience members for being part of this. Thanks.
Thank you. My pleasure.